Do you think a coalition government would be in a better position to work with a Trump administration than a Labor government?
I think a coalition government will be better placed to work with either US administration because we've shown our great ability to be able to work so successfully over the years. I'm sure we will be, that Australia's relationship will of course always be in good order with the US. All governments have done that. But of course I back ourselves to be able to achieve the strongest possible outcomes for Australia. And we saw that in the way in which Joe Hockey did so, working as part of the Turnbull and Morrison governments to make sure that we received exemptions from tariffs and trade imposts under the first Trump administration. We saw it, though, equally working with a Democratic administration from the way in which Scott Morrison and the team were able to secure AUKUS. That was a deal between a coalition government and the Biden administration, a Democratic administration. We've demonstrated the ability to work right across the board, of course, going all the way back to when Robert Menzies signed the ANZUS treaty all those years ago.
Do you think the whole climate change and renewables issue would turn if Trump was elected?
I think President Trump, in his first administration, showed obviously the resolve in terms of his policy position to withdraw from Paris, and he's indicated that he'd likely follow the same path in terms of withdrawing from that Paris Agreement in a second administration. But there is clearly a huge investment around the world in terms of the technological changes. So how that would impact in terms of what it would mean for government policies and some of those policy approaches versus what it might mean for technology and investment in those technologies, we'd have to see. I expect the market would continue to still invest significantly, and you can see the way in which the likes of Bill Gates have now written and spoken extensively around the need to see those technologies invested in ways that make them truly cost competitive to ensure that we can drive a lower emissions future right around the world, because that is what's going to make it not only feasible for countries like the US or ourselves to undertake that change, but also critically for other countries, be it in Indonesia or in India or China, to make the change. They need to see it as being cost competitive and viable for their future. Clearly, we're putting our policies on the table for the next election, critically in terms of net zero emissions, nuclear technologies.
Do you think Kevin Rudd's position is tenable if Trump gets re-elected?
It will be up to Mr Rudd to demonstrate his capacity to continue to do the job and do it as effectively as he has been, to give him credit.
So a coalition.
Both sides of Congress.
I've spoken to Peter Dutton about this before a few months ago. You'd be okay if he can demonstrate that he can work with. I mean, there's two hypotheticals in this one, obviously, if not three. But you'd be okay for him to continue as ambassador under a coalition government if he was going okay?
Andrew, the short answer there is yes. Kevin Rudd has worked the Congress hard and effectively, I would say, during his time as ambassador. We've got outcomes there in relation to AUKUS and changes to some of the export rules that are really important in terms of better integration of our defence industries. And we want to see that type of momentum continue.
Is that
and our assessment will be on what is in Australia's best interest.
Okay. Is that Peter Dutton's view?
Kevin Rudd and Anthony Albanese's assessment too.
Is that Peter Dutton's view too?
That we want to do what is in Australia's best interest.
That Rudd could continue. Have you spoken to him?
Kevin Rudd is demonstrating, if Andrew, yes, and if Kevin Rudd is demonstrating that he is getting the job done and can do the job for a coalition government with a Republican administration, well, of course, then we will assess that on its merits. But ultimately, it's about getting the job done in Washington and making sure that Australia's influence is as strong as possible. Now, clearly, it's well reported what Kevin has said in the past, equally. We've seen him engage and try to build ties across the Republican Party and engage there in Congress. Whether that will be sufficient with an incoming Trump administration, I hope that Kevin Rudd and Anthony Albanese, if that proves to be the case, will be honest enough in terms of how they undertake that assessment and will consider Australia's best interest, because that's what we will be putting forward, regardless of Kevin Rudd's political background.
Okay, briefly, do you think Donald Trump would seek to bring an end to the war in Ukraine, and is that a good thing or a bad thing?
He's said that he would, and bringing an end to the war is a good thing. What we want to see is a just outcome for Ukraine. And a just outcome for Ukraine is one where their country has confidence in its security and its sovereignty into the future. We cannot have a situation where Russia finishes this feeling emboldened, in a stronger position, and potentially repeating the type of horrors that we've seen in the last couple of years. So, of course, we want to see an end to the war. We'd love to see an end to conflicts in all manner of different situations, but how you end those conflicts is critical. And in this case, a just outcome for Ukraine, who was certainly not the aggressor in this case. Russia have been the aggressor.
Sure.
Russia have, of course, pursued this in a way that is a huge violation of Ukraine's territorial sovereignty, but also, importantly, if they are allowed to feel victorious and to be in a situation where they feel empowered to do it again, it sends a terrible signal to other autocrats around the world.
Now, late last week, Penny Wong, the Foreign Minister, bought a $3.4 million house in Adelaide, and you put a message on social media saying media shouldn't reveal the house. What was that about?
Safety and security for any politician, Andrew. Media are free to report these things. We disclose our interests. There's been plenty of a discussion about declaration of interest. We disclose those. If you think it's newsworthy, you report it. But when it comes to those safety or security considerations, it shouldn't be reported in ways where it becomes all too easy for people to identify the precise.
Had Penny Wong,
a prominent member of Parliament,
sure, had Penny Wong spoken to you before you ushered that tweet out there? Had Penny Wong spoken to you?
Penny and I had no engagement whatsoever before I put that.
Do you have a similar issue with Anthony Albanese's house purchase and where that's located? Do you have the same view on that?
I think in terms of it being easily identifiable, arguably there are issues there. The one point of difference I'd make is, of course, whilst Anthony Albanese remains Australia's Prime Minister, he is living in government-provided and government-secured houses.
Sure.
Penny Wong, me, anybody else, Peter Dutton, we're all living in our private homes that are privately funded and provided, and of course don't necessarily come with those same security standards that the Lodge or Kirribilli House.
Let me ask about flight upgrades then. Do you have any problems on the coalition side on this one? What's your understanding around how many upgrades Bridget McKenzie hasn't declared? Should she face penalty from Peter Dutton or David Littleproud if she hasn't made all relevant declarations? In fact, if she's failed to make a number of declarations?
Well, Andrew, it is a responsibility for us to make our declarations, and we should be keeping those up to date. And if people have had administrative errors in their own undertakings or those of their officers, then they need to rectify and fix those. What is important about this debate, and where I've certainly kept all of my comments, is actually then about if there are areas of influence, how does an office holder in government actually influence? How is that government applying that influence, and how does it influence their decisions? And in the case of Anthony Albanese, none of this really would have been a matter of public interest if it wasn't for the decision this government took around Qatar Airways and their refusal to provide them with additional flight slots in and out of Australia. And Anthony Albanese's never been transparent about whether he or his office exercised influence over Catherine King's decision to refuse those upgrades. We know that Catherine King gave the Virgin CEO every indication that she was about to approve them, and then suddenly the decision was delayed for months, and then it was rejected.
Wasn't
and
Paul
never
Fletcher
been a clear answer from the government about why it was rejected?
Didn't Paul Fletcher have some upgrades when he was in the transport infrastructure space as a minister?
I've seen media reports of that. I can't say that I've gone looking for those things. Paul, I don't think, has ever had responsibility for aviation policy, though.
Simon Birmingham, thanks for your time.
Thanks, Andrew. My pleasure.